Sony's new ZV-E10 Mark II might be the best video camera for creators. That sounds like an exaggeration, but let me explain. I mean best as in the image quality, the compact size, loads of built-in features, all while priced at $999. Full disclosure, Sony did lend me this camera for me to review, but all my opinions are my own and Sony didn't have any input into this video. Alright, let's dive right in. Let's start off with image quality. The Sony ZV-E10 Mark II shares the same 26 megapixel APS-C sensor that's in the 𝗚𝗔𝗡𝗏, which is the same sensor that's in the incredible FX30. So we're already starting off extremely strong here. The footage captured is a 5.6K image oversampled to a 4K output with around 15 total stops of dynamic range. With this camera, you can shoot in Sony's XAVC-SI codec to get 422 10-bit footage, making 𝗚𝗔𝗥𝗔𝗣𝗧𝗘𝗥𝗦 viable for shooting some incredibly, dare I say, cinematic footage. And if you're looking to shoot some slow motion goodness, you can also shoot in 1080p 120 frames per second, as well as 4K 60 frames per second, which looks incredibly good. Just know that there is a 10% crop when you shoot in 4K 60 frames per second. Now, the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II does not have a dedicated AI chip, but it still boasts Sony's best-in-class autofocus system with human, animal, and bird subject recognition, making autofocus tracking of subjects with this camera a breeze. Now, let's talk about low light performance real quick. If you followed me for a while, you'll know that the reason why I switched into the Sony ecosystem was, well, because of the incredible autofocus, but also because the Sony a7S series cameras are magical with their low light capabilities. Now, the ZV-E10 Mark II has an APS-C sensor, so it's not going to be as good in low light as its full frame brothers, but that's not to say it can't put out some incredible looking footage in low light conditions. It really comes down to understanding how 𝗚𝗏3 footage color grades and trying to shoot with just enough light to fight off the digital noise. Now, if you're familiar with the ZV-E10 Mark I, the predecessor, then you might be concerned with rolling shutter. It's still present and noticeable. In real-world usage, I personally never panned this aggressively, and in the footage I got with a fast-moving background, it didn't really stand out to me. Honestly, image quality-wise, this packs as much of a punch as my FX30 does. On top of the image quality, the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II is also packed with a bunch of features. It has the cinematic vlog mode, which adds CinemaScope black bars baked into the footage, auto switches to 24 frames per second, and lets you quickly and easily dial in a look for your shot. It also has the soft skin effect, which can be turned off or set to 3 levels of intensity between low, medium, and high. Then there's the product showcase mode, which tells the camera to stop prioritizing autofocus on the face and instead on the center zone, which lets you bring products into the frame for the camera to focus on even if your face is still in the background. There's also background defocus mode, which basically switches the camera to prioritize opening up the aperture so that you can achieve a blurry background, something that's really helpful for beginners. And if you're on the more advanced side of the spectrum, you can also import user LUTs so you can monitor exactly what your footage is going to look like after you've color graded it, so you can better set your exposure and white balance while shooting. Alright, let's look at the build quality of the ZV-E10 Mark II. Overall, it's a very familiar feeling camera if you've held any of Sony's more compact camera bodies like the ZV-E1 or the 𝗚𝗏𝗧𝗏 series. The camera body itself is made of a recycled plastic material and honestly, at the end of the day, feels well built while staying incredibly compact and lightweight. The ZV-E10 Mark II feels pretty small in my hands if I'm being honest, and I have small hands to start with. But to me, that just means the camera's really compact and easy to take with you, and as you rig it up with like a cage and accessories, it'll kind of be the perfect size. The camera has all of the expected features and a recognizable layout of a modern Sony camera. The biggest callouts here are going to be the inclusion of a tally lamp on the front of the camera so you or the subject knows that the camera's rolling, as well as the emphasized recording outline on the camera monitor. And since this camera's focused primarily on video, there's no viewfinder on it, but that doesn't stop this camera from taking some fantastic photos if you wanted to. Similar to other compact cameras in the Sony mirrorless lineup, this camera only has a single SD card slot. Now here's 2 upgrades on the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II that got me really excited. First, they finally upgraded the camera to use the larger NPF-Z100 batteries instead of the smaller NPF-W50 batteries. These are the same batteries that's used in the full-frame mirrorless cameras and just means you'll be able to shoot for much longer on a single battery compared to before. Second, the camera monitor is following in line with all of the other latest Sony camera releases and is now touchscreen capable. The menu system has also been updated to use Sony's latest menu layout, which is still a little confusing, but much better to navigate. But most importantly, the info display on the touchscreen can be rotated vertically. I don't know what took Sony so long to implement this quality of life feature, but it's finally here. When I was on location working on a client project that was all shot vertically, I can't begin to tell you how annoying it was for all of my camera info to be displayed sideways while I was shooting. Sony, if you're watching, please add this feature to all of the other cameras via a firmware update. Please. While we're on the note of build quality, let's talk about audio quality and the built-in microphone. The ZV-E10 Mark II is utilizing the new microphone array, the 3-capsule array that was first introduced in the ZV-E1. This microphone lets you choose either omnidirectional, so it can just pick up audio from all around, or focus on either audio that's coming from in front of the camera or behind the camera. Again, this is a nice little upgrade, but if you want to take your audio seriously, I think that an external microphone will still be the way to go. All right, let's get to the two negatives of this camera, starting with overheating. There have been a lot of numbers I've seen posted by various other reviewers like 𝗚𝗘𝗥𝗔𝗣. All of these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt because your results may vary drastically depending on a bunch of factors, like whether or not it was humid out, whether or not it's gonna be sunny out, whether or not it's gonna be breezy out. The takeaway for me here is that yes, the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II can overheat. But here's what I said in the Sony ZV-E1 video, and I'll say it here again. This can be a massive deal breaker or just a potential inconvenience depending on what you shoot. If you are often shooting wedding ceremonies for long stretches in sunny and hot weather, there's a good chance this will overheat on you. But if you're shooting outdoor events and you're just shooting clips at a time because you're creating a highlight reel, then I don't think it's gonna be as much of a problem. I've owned the Sony ZV-E1 for over a year now, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, this camera's gonna overheat on you, you can't use it, it's unusable. The truth of the matter is it's only ever overheated on me 4 times. 2 of those times was when I was trying to live stream with the camera and the USB-C port was plugged in, to keep the camera charged, but that also generated heat and caused it to overheat. The other 2 times was because I was shooting outdoors on a hot 98-degree day, full sun, and I kind of just left the camera on the tripod without realizing it for an hour, and so eventually, yeah, it overheated. But the flip side of that is I've also used the ZV-E1 on wedding shoots without ever running into a problem. Now, I truly believe that Sony does need to address this and in future iterations reduce the potential for overheating in their cameras because it really shouldn't be a roll of the dice. But at the same time, I feel like the overheating fear is a bit blown out of proportion. Now, let's move on to stabilization. This is personally my biggest negative and potentially biggest deal breaker, is that the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II does not have in-body image stabilization. It does, however, have an active software-based stabilization. Here's a shot with me vlogging with the Laowa 10mm f2.8 full-frame lens with and without active stabilization on. And here's a test with me walking with the new 16 to 50mm kit lens with and without active stabilization on, and note that on top of that, this lens also has optical steady shot built in. Overall, the results are impressive and the software stabilization really does a decent job, but I still have one big gripe over this. In hardware stabilization, the IBIS physically moves the sensor to counteract any jittery movements to create a smoother shot. In software stabilization, the software in post-processing stabilizes the footage to counter any jitteriness to create a smooth shot. That sounds similar, but it's not. When you shoot video, you try to adhere to the 180-degree shutter rule, where you try to double your shutter speed in relation to your frame rate. So if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, I want my shutter speed at 1/48 or 1/50. This way you get that natural cinematic looking motion blur. But what happens when you get footage that is stabilized after it's recorded? You get these motion blur streaks as an artifact and it just doesn't look good. Now, personally, I prefer to use external stabilizers like gimbals, tripods, and sliders, and if you do just that, then you'll avoid this problem, but it just kind of sucks that I don't get to have IBIS in the camera. If you do, however, want to use this active stabilization, like for example, for vlogging, holding the camera and talking to it, then what I would recommend you do is to, instead of 2xing your frame rate, go 4x or 5x your frame rate to shutter speed. So now shoot at 1/200 or 1/250. This will reduce the amount of motion blur, and so when the software stabilizes the footage, it looks better. Alright, so let's talk about price and whether this camera is right for you. The Sony ZV-E10 Mark II is priced at $999 for the body only and $1,099 for the body plus the updated kit lens, which for $100 is pretty hard to beat. It's not my favorite lens in the world, but it has optical steady shot, it's compact, and it's really cheap. Now, is this the right video camera for you? Well, for $999, you get the image quality that you would get out of an FX30, which is quite impressive. But if I scared you with the whole overheating and lack of stabilization, then I would recommend you look at the FX30. Priced at $1,799, it's basically the ZV-E10 Mark II, but without any compromises. Another factor to look at would be how important is low light performance to you. The ZV-E10 Mark II can produce some stunning looking footage, but if you really want that full frame low light performance capabilities, then I would steer you towards the Sony ZV-E1, which is priced at $2,199. It's a fantastic full frame camera and I use it for about 40% of all of my video work. But then we're right back to the whole overheating problem, and again, if that's something you're concerned about, then I would point you towards the FX3, which is priced at $3,899. This will be your absolute no compromise solution for all of your videography needs. Which brings me back to the opening of this video where I said that the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II is the best video camera for creators. I still stand by that. That's because for $999, you get access to the same sensor that's in the FX30, all while getting some of the latest features from Sony cameras. If you're willing to work around some of the potential negatives of the system, you're still looking at an incredible engine under the hood. The Sony ZV-E10 Mark II is a perfect camera for beginners, all while being able to grow with you and able to deliver footage that punches well above its price tag.